Chris, but you may also call me Mad Cat. And we are joined today by Gerimi Burleigh. Is that right?
Burleigh.
Burleigh?
Yes.
I like that better.
I'll respond to all variations. So, my parents could make it easy on me. First name easy to butcher. Last name, impossible to pronounce.
All right, so I'm joined by Gerimi Burleigh, author of the graphic novel series Morning Star and Eye of the Gods. I initially met Jeremy at Phoenix Comic Con. After the first day, I met like all of the novelists, and I'm like, oh great, what am I going to do for the other 2 days? I'm like, well, let's go meet the artists and see what they have to say. And I was surprised that I should have known better, but I was surprised that, oh, there are writers amongst the artists. I thought, here are the writers, here are the artists. So. And of course, I met Jeremy, and I only talked to him for a little bit, but I'm like, I like this guy. So when I did an interview, well, not an interview, I did a post on my blog about my experience with him, and we just sort of started talking from there and got this interview underway. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual interview. Jeremy, how about you tell us a few things about yourself?
All right. Well, like you said, I am a comic book writer and artist. Published a graphic novel, Eye of the Gods, and I'm currently working on a series of Morning Star. My background, I've always loved drawing and writing. I was exposed to comic books at an early age, so it seemed natural for me to be interested in both and want to go into comics. I never really thought, I enjoy reading a lot of prose, sci-fi, fantasy, various forms of fiction, but I never saw myself as being strictly a prose author. By the same token, I never really thought of myself as somebody who would just do illustration, doing standalone painting, book covers. I really enjoy the narrative marrying of the visual and the literary storytelling. So comics just sort of sucked me in. All through high school, I collected comics. I went to my first San Diego Comic-Con when I was in high school. I actually worked as a volunteer, so I went down with a buddy of mine, and my folks just let us rent a hotel room, and they were like, "Yeah, sure, go, have fun." That was back when parents didn't want their kids to school and let them get the hitch ride with strangers. But the UCLA as a fine art major. Going through that program, it was a really good program for learning about creativity and how to think about ideas and conceptualize, but they weren't necessarily concerned about illustration. They didn't have an illustration program. So I started studying animation while I was working there, and that's when I was like, oh, animators really need to know how to draw, understand shape and volume, and be able to rotate things in space. So, I started using the rest of my life, the rest of the time I was in college, in animation. I was an intern at Nickelodeon for a while, and once I got out of school, I found it difficult to find full-time work in animation, so I went into graphic design. Ended up working in the toy industry, which I still do today, doing packaging and product design. And I like to say that during the day I make toys, but at night I sweat and read comics. So that is me in a nutshell.
Emphasis on nut. I mean.
It's on shell. I'm so quiet, sheltered.
Tough outer shell, creamy. Never mind. All right, so
I've got more of a nougat thing going on. Nougat center.
What's up?
I've got more of a creamy nougat center.
All right, yeah, I don't want to really think about that.
It's definitely going to degenerate the conversation. Let's continue. Sorry.
That's all right. All right, so you stated that you went to UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
And what years did you do that for?
From 94 to 98. Graduated with a BFA in fine art. Oddly enough, I don't think it even says on my diploma that it's a specialty in drawing and painting. That's kind of what I focused on. The way the program is structured, you can either focus on drawing, painting, sculpture, photography, or new media. But I think there might be one other One
Finger
of the
paints?
finger
Finger
paints.
painting?
Oh, I definitely would have majored in finger paints if they'd offered it. They were like, no. Well, usually, art students end up cutting their fingertips off effectively, you know, halfway through their sophomore year. So, I mean, there's that. I ended up all stumpy. I lucked out. I kept all mine. I guess that's what I was like, all right. It probably because spending my time drawing comics.
Okay, everyone, we're going to use finger paints today. Now, this has acetone in it, so if you've got your fingers. All right, so.
I think you're stump painting. You're just sort of.
I'm getting some ideas now. All right, so before we get into your writing and pick that apart, I want to understand the toy industry. What can you tell me about that?
I would love to understand the toy industry as well. I've been there for over a decade. Still makes no sense. No, so the toy industry is, I think, it's like a lot of other creative industries where there's, a few major corporations. Actually, it's very similar to comics in the fact that, with Marvel and DC, there's the big two in there. With the toy industry, it's Hasbro and Mattel, and there's a whole variety of other companies underneath that are juggling for like third, fourth, fifth place. I work at a company called Jack's Pacific. They're a fairly large toy company in the West Coast. I actually was hired by one of their subsidiaries, a company called Maui Toys. That's the company I actually work for, and Jack's owns ours. We kind of operate as an independent branch. But when I first got into the toy industry, I worked at a company called MGA Entertainment. They're a toy company out in the San Fernando Valley. They have a doll line called the Brats, which are like these large, big-eyed, teen dolls, kind of sexy. They're kind of like competitors to Barbie. But I got probably my most significant experience in animation working for them because they wanted to develop a toy line that was going to be their G.I. Joe, their Transformer. They wanted a boy's companion to their successful girls' property. And I had pitched an idea to the owner of the company. But the way I pitched in the toy line was different from the way I think most toy pitches go. I didn't come in with a bunch of presentation boards with products and show them what things we could or couldn't sell. What I did instead was I came in with a book of storyboards. And I sat down and I told them a story. It was a science fiction project. We never ended up actually going forward with it. But what I did was I sat down with a bunch of storyboards and told them a story. And told them about these are the characters, this is what they're going through, this is the world they live in, and gave them an idea of the world. And based on that story, I said, we can make all the stuff that you would normally have in any particular, toy line. The action figures, the vehicles, the role play toys. The point is that it's story-based. Now, while we didn't end up developing the idea that I had pitched, he saw that my approach to toys and to product design was story-driven rather than just the product and the features. So when we did come up with a toy line that had product and features, which is what tends to lead the industry, it had products and features that he felt that he could build a strong toy line around. He partnered me with the product designer. And eventually another writer who worked at the company was a copywriter. He joined us, and together we developed the world for these characters. And it ended up becoming an animated series that ran very briefly on Fox back in the early 2000s called Alien Racers. So it ran on Fox for 5 episodes, and I think the episode that I wrote was the last episode that aired on Fox. But they also incorporated part of what I wrote into a 90-minute special that on Cartoon Network. And while it didn't make it a full season in the United States, apparently it ran in Canada and some places in Europe, and I think it still airs some places around the world. In fact, it's on Hulu Plus. So if anyone's got Hulu Plus, you can go watch it. It's called Alien Racers. Go check it out.
Yes, for every video of that you watch, he gets 5 cents. So, go watch it.
If I had a nickel for everyone that watched that show, I'd have a bag of nickels.
You'd have enough for a soda.
No, it was probably one of the most pleasurable professional experiences I've ever had. Our story editor, Bob Ford, he used to be a storyboard artist on He-Man. He's worked on a lot of the Transformers CG properties, and it was really great to be able to work side by side with somebody who really knew and understood the animation story, and I learned a lot about craft from him. And there's a wide variety of professionals, in the animation industry who all write on each other's shows. There's sort of like a small group of top-tier animation writers, And they'll work on one project, another person will work. Whatever, when there's a story editor on one project, they'll hire a lot of the other writers that they know and they've worked with on theirs because they know what these writers can deliver. They've worked under them as story editors. So, I remember we had a big kickoff meeting and there were a bunch of writers in there that had written pretty much everything I'd grown up watching. And at one point, I remember Greg Weisman was there, and I think he wrote one of the episodes. And I thought, Greg Weisman was the creator of the cartoon series Gargoyles, the Disney animated series. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a fantastic show. And I remember sitting in this room and thinking, he's going to be writing an episode of a cartoon I came up with, and I'm all, what is wrong with this universe? What happened that I'm this fortunate? And I honestly do believe that it's being fortunate. I think that a lot of luck was involved because, while I do believe I have some interesting ideas and I have some skill as a storyteller, it is honestly just the fact that I was in a place, a company that had the ability to make cartoons. I had access to the people that were doing it, and they were open to listening to my ideas. It's not like I was some sort of Wonder King writer who just was coming with great ideas. Like, honestly, if I had it to do over again, I could think of 10 different ways to make the show 100 times better and actually have made it successful. But it's almost like I had to make this show that was interesting, but it ultimately, failed, in terms of finance for the company, only to learn how to make something better. And when I say failed, I mean the show still exists. You just the property. Who knows? They may bring it back in another 5 years where the Transformers and G.I. Joe keep coming back, and it may end up being a smash hit, me not necessarily being involved with it, because people who do want to sell those things would be working at the wheel this time. But it's almost like, I feel like for almost anything, writing, drawing, filmmaking, failure is the best teacher. You can spend forever trying to create something perfect, and you just toil away, and you never show any work to anybody. Whereas you write a short story, you draw an issue of a comic book or one shot, or you do a short graphic novel, you make a short film, you make that. It's definitely flawed and imperfect, but taking it all the way to completion and putting it out in the world and the feedback you get from people, you see not only do you learn a lot from that process, but in the feedback you get from people, things that you thought were horrible absolute failures, sometimes people respond to in a very positive way. You're all, oh wait, I just wasn't looking at this right. And there's also things that you may think, oh, this was the best thing in the entire project. This was genius. People are going to love it. And it's like, So, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for learning from failure as opposed to toiling away trying to craft perfection. Because nothing's perfect. We all know that. When we try to create something, it's never perfect. There's always things you look back in retrospect and say you could have done better.
Well, something I've been thinking about lately, because, I want to, hopefully next year at Comic-Con I can actually speak on the indie writing process as being a novelist, because I think that was really what was missing. They have new writers, but they're all traditional publishing, and it's like, fantastic for you, but that doesn't help me any. Mm-hmm. But something I was thinking about what you're saying about failure being a great learning tool, that one of the disadvantages of doing indie writing is that when you're doing traditional publishing and you're going all these publishers, agents, and all of that, they give you rejection letters. Now, sometimes it's just a check on a box, no, we're not interested. Sometimes they give you a little bit more information, hey, this is why we didn't do it. And indie publishing doesn't have that feature. The only way you can know whether something is good or not is when people start giving you a star rating. And if you do something like horrifically bad, even if you go back and change it, it's still going to be a part of the book itself. When people go and view it, and it's like, oh, someone gave it a 1 star for this reason, it's going to forever taint your book. So one of the things that you have to do as an indie writer, more so than traditional publishing, is you need to get as many different people to read it as possible, and look for the good stuff, but try to get them to tell you the bad things about it. Mm-hmm. Has that been your experience in doing indie comic books?
Well, it has been, but what I find a little bit frustrating is like I've got a group of I'm just as bad because everybody that's creating things is busy and distracted and a lot going on. But I have a few friends that are also writer artists, or some friends that are comic book writers, and I'll frequently send early drafts of my comics to them for feedback. And a lot of times everyone's just too busy to give feedback, and I understand that because they're busy working on their projects. And when friends send me work to get my feedback, I try to do it in a timely manner, but if it's a large body of work, then I tell them I'm not going to be able to get this back in a timely manner. If it's something that's more than a single issue, I'm like, I'm not going to be able to carve out the time for this in the next couple of weeks, and I imagine they probably want feedback quickly. I would say that's definitely a big challenge, is getting the actual feedback that's going to make your work better, rather than someone just saying, oh, this is good, it sucks. Something that I've been thinking about, honestly, in terms of reading interviews with people about indie publishing and writing, is how some indie authors will hire an editor. And I've been thinking about budgeting for future projects, budgeting in the cost of having someone to actually professionally edit my work. It's pricey, and I don't know for sure if I'm going to do it, and I don't know for sure if I'm going to do it with every project. And there's also trying an editor, and trying on an editor is like trying on, honestly, like a comic book penciler trying on different inkers. Not every inker is suitable for every artist or for every project. I might have to do some trial and error to find an editor that fits what I'm doing. But I definitely do realize the need to have feedback on the story end, because I've spent most of my life learning how to draw. I'm not a master draftsman by any standard. I still go to figure drawing classes regularly. I still continue to study the drawing side of the craft. But that said, I always did pretty well in English class in school, but I haven't really studied literature with the depth that most writers do. So I also feel like on the writing side, I'm playing a lot of catch up now. I'm going through and reading novels that I somehow escaped reading in college or high school. I'm going to go back and re-educate myself, reading more books on the craft of writing. And that's one of those things where it's much like drawing. It's a road that's never going to end. There's always going to be more resources. Like, I've definitely read a bunch of Shakespeare plays in high school and college, but one of the things I want to do at some point in the near future is work my way through the entire works of Shakespeare. On a long plane ride, I read through all the sonnets, and while they were interesting, I did get a bit bored about halfway through, just because I'm not necessarily a sonnety type guy. But that said, I've also been thinking about the fact that I've never even remotely considered myself someone who's interested in studying poetry. But the more I read, in terms of reading other authors with dialogue, some of the most compelling dialogue in books has a poetic flow to it, almost like the way that Quentin Tarantino's dialogue in his films have a very specific delivery that is equal parts performance as well as communication and narrative. And so looking at studying poetry to try and help improve my dialogue is another thing that I'm thinking about. Now, these are all things that it's not like I'm actively grinding away at it. It's more like I constantly have like 10 different back burners of things that I want to study and learn to improve my craft on all levels. And they're all the things that I constantly, whenever there's a slot open, I'm like, oh, well, let me pick up this Jonathan Franzen novel because I've heard great things about him as a writer. Let me just read through some of his work. Let me pick up this Kip Elliott, collection of poetry and recent stuff that of his work I haven't experienced before. So that kind of thing. So I'm always trying to fill in the gaps and keep learning. Another thing that I find both with writers and artists is that sense of beating up on yourself for not being good enough. And you get frustrated with yourself. And what I learned from figure drawing classes is I watch people just literally be cursing at their drawing books. Their drawings are coming out that as well as they'd like. And I've been doing it for enough years at figure drawing where I come in and I'm no longer concerned about whether the drawing is good or bad. I'm concerned about whether I learn or not. And that really frees one up to simply enjoy the learning process and the creative process. being able to really enjoy learning without beating yourself up is extremely gratifying. And I found that I can carry that attitude into the writing side and learning too, where it's okay if I write a whole story and I'm like, okay, this is crap. If I can sit there and say, well, why is it crap, and dissect it, I can make that act of the dissecting and regurgitating, tearing apart, and rebuilding pleasant for myself, as opposed to me just, just pounding my head against the keyboard. I think I've seen that in just about every creative field. Actors, musicians, everyone I know is creative. At some point, they're constantly banging their heads and beating themselves up. And I'm trying to remove that from my life and encourage other people to remove it as well. Because it makes the thing you're trying to work around and get through easier if you actually aren't as angry at yourself while you're doing it. So it's okay to stop, as long as you try to get better.
So there's like so many things that you just said that I want to touch on in that. So I'm making a list now. Excuse me, making a list now of things I want to do, because you're very I don't know what the word is. I want to say prolific. I don't know if that's the right word at the moment, but you're just bursting with like good conversational topics as you talk. But I wanted to first, you're talking about wanting to read things that have a lot of good dialogue to help you. And I want to shamelessly plug this author here. His name is Tom Levine. He was actually at Phoenix Comic-Con. I've met him a couple of times. He actually comes from a theater background. And the thing I liked about him, he's like, the thing that he learned from doing theater for so many years and is that there's a big focus on dialogue. And it's what you were saying about Shakespeare and all of that. So, what he learned from that, he was able to put into his writing. And from what I've seen, others describe his book as, and what he's described his book as, is it's really good on the dialogue. So if you're interested, it's young adult. I don't know how you necessarily feel about that. I'm not a fan of it, but I like him, so I want to read his book this summer and give him a rating on it. But from what little I've read of it, it's actually pretty good dialogue. So I think that might help you out.
Oh yeah, I'll definitely check it
out. Also, you were talking about sonnets and poetry and how you want to use that for your writing. And I think that's a really good idea to do, because it's something that I use when I write, especially action sequences, because my poetry, when I wrote poetry, was always free-form poetry, but it still kind of had a rhythm to it and was always very intense. It was just like a lot of short lines as well, and that's what they teach you when you're doing an action sequence for, writing a short story or a novel, is that you need to pick up the rhythm, you need to pick up the tempo by writing shorter sentences, using smaller words so people can get through them faster, but at the same time being a little bit on the descriptive side. It's a very hard thing to do, but if you can do it, it's effective. And I find that my years writing poetry, which I no longer have any of the poetry anymore, which is sad, but I find like I'm starting to write poetry again when I'm doing an action sequence. So I think that's a very good thing that you were saying there about wanting to look at poetry and study it to apply to your writing. And also, the last thing I wanted to say on that little speech you had there, that rant, I really like what you're saying about not being concerned about the quality of what you're doing as you're doing it. And I perfectly agree with you that it's when you become concerned about how good it is as you're working on it, it takes away from your creativity. And I see this in writing a lot, and this is why I kind of do things the way I do, where people will start writing a story, and then there's a little squiggly line for this word is misspelled, so you go and you correct it, not a big deal. But then it's like, this sentence is a fragment sentence, so they begin working and trying to figure out, okay, how do I make this not a fragment sentence? Or they'll look at a scene, it's like, how do I write this scene? How does it make sense? How do I get it exactly right? And it's like, just write it. Don't care about what is good and what is bad. Don't care about what is correct and incorrect. Just write it. Get done with it. So I've removed that completely. As I say on my other interviews, I just go into Notepad on my PC and I just start writing. I don't know if something is correct or not. I don't know if I've misspelled anything. Well, I do know I'm a very bad speller, but I don't have confirmation that I've misspelled anything. And I just write all the way through. I mean, if you actually look at the document, it's just a bunch of words. I do format it properly so I can understand it, but if I think that's really good advice that you gave there, that you need to just focus on what you're doing and be worried about if it's good later when you're done with it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's there's the editing process. There's a reason why people do second and third and fourth drafts. There's always structural problems that need to be fixed. There's always minor details that need to be fixed. Lines of dialogue that you realize, oh, this sounds like it's part of the story, but it actually makes sense coming out of a different character's mouth. And it's just shuffling the pieces around. But I think part of that also might necessarily be due to the approach of the writer, because I know there's some people that are discovery writers. They sit down and they just start going mainstream, and then there's people that are outliners. And I am definitely of the outline persuasion, which can make things a little bit plotty, and that actually probably makes sense why my difficulties might struggle more in terms of the dialogue side and the character side, in terms of really making it feel like rich, real people, because the events are usually what I divided around. Then I try to think of people that would be interesting to put into these situations. But the structure of the plot comes first, whereas some people might be able to create a character who on the page feels living and breathing and feels like an actual person. It feels like an identity, but the narrative itself might be a little rambling. They don't know where they're going and what's going to happen to them. And I think that's that challenge of nitpicking, is that if you don't know necessarily where you're going, then each sentence that you write, you're like, well, is this good? Is this bad? Because you feel like with each sentence you write, you're stepping further and further out on the gangplank. You're just walking out there, whereas you don't know if there's a bridge on the other side that you're building to. You just hope, but you're building with faith. Whereas structurally, if you're more of a plot person, what you're building may not necessarily look beautiful at the start, but you're starting at the bottom of the ravine, and you're building up that bridge all the way up to the top. So it's the difference between building from the ground up as opposed to out into the void. And out into the void, honestly, I can see how that's extremely exciting. And I may try, I've thought about doing a couple of comic projects where I just simply start with a premise or a character and go, and not know where I'm going to end up with it. But for me, you would be doing it just to strengthen that muscle and test it out. Because generally, when I think of stories, whenever an idea comes to me, what originally comes up, what usually pops in my head is an initial question. And very quickly after that question usually comes what my idea the answer is. So I usually have an idea of what the end is at the very beginning. And it's hard for me to go much further in the story if I don't know how it's going to end. I tend to figure out very early on what the ending is. And that doesn't mean that I'm locked into that ending, because again, it's an outline. I can change it. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just have an ending to write to, and then I write out the whole structure, outline the whole story, start fleshing out the characters and the dialogue. And as I'm doing that, I may get to a point 2/3 of the way through, and I'm like, what if I just kill off this character and change the ending? And I try to leave myself the freedom and leeway to say what interesting directions is the story going to take me if I deviate from my outline. But I tend to come up with structure first. It's not like I worked hard to develop this plotting skill. It's just when I think of stories, I think of this is the beginning. I think in terms of beginning, middle, and end. That's what usually comes to me. And then I'm like, all right, how do I make this journey easier? That's what I put my work into, is making the journey. Um, Rant number 2.
No, keep talking. No, I wanted to ask you, another shamelessly plugging a book,
Favorite.
although here's backwards for me. Have you read this book?
I have it. I reread it usually once a year. That is a favorite. I mean, I love Stephen King as an author generally, but when that book came out, it really, it's one of the things that got me on track for starting. I don't read as much prose as I should, because, they say, if you don't have time to read, you don't have time to write. But I've been trying to get back into the habit of having a prose book by my bedside, and just reading a little bit every day and working through more books. I mean, the work ethic, that I think was the biggest thing I took away from that book, is the work ethic of sitting down and just showing up. In fact, I actually had a note card that is above, it's not above my drawing table right now because I think we moved and stuff is shoved around, but I had this big corkboard above my drawing table that I would just post reference and story notes and character designs, what have you. But the one thing I had in the middle of that board was an index card that just says, the hardest part is showing up. Because it is. If you don't show up, nothing's going to happen.
Well, yeah, that is a good thing there, and that's one of my biggest challenges right now is just showing up. I haven't touched writing in nearly a month because of all of my personal shit that's going on, which, as much as I hate not writing, I think if anyone were to see my situation, like, okay, yeah, it's understandable that you're not writing every day, and I try to do it when I can. But there was something in this book that I was thinking about what you were talking about with character building and doing it solely from that. And I think it's okay having an idea of what your ending is, because Stephen King was talking about the book Misery.
Mm-hmm.
And he stated that when he started writing this story, he had this idea, and sorry for spoilers, but the movie has been out for like 20 years, so if you haven't seen it yet, that's your own fault. It's a fantastic movie. I love it. But in the movie, well, Stephen King thought that the movie would end because it's basically... Have you seen the movie at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for anyone who hasn't and doesn't mind that this is a spoiler, I'm just... basically, this fanatic takes this writer hostage. It at first looks like she rescued him, but keeps him in a room and forces him to write a story for her. That's the basic synopsis of it. And what she wanted to do is take credit for writing the story herself and kill the writer. And that's how he thought the story would end, is like her at a typewriter claiming that she had written it. But the thing I love about Stephen King, there's a lot that I hate about Stephen King, but I just think it's a difference in style between me and him. But the thing I love about him, the thing that really made me, I think, a good writer from Stephen King, is character writing, in that you let your characters tell the story. And he found that his character Sheldon, I think his name was Sheldon, wanted to fight back. He wasn't just going to let this happen. He had to fight back. And to Stephen King's surprise, it's like, wait a minute, where did this guy come from? All of a sudden, he's planning to turn the tables on her, and it ended up creating so much of a better ending than what he initially had. And that's always been my approach to writing. I do outline a little bit. I have a general sense of what the plot's going to be, a couple of key elements here and there, but I spend a lot more time developing my characters. And the way I see it is, okay, I have this fully developed character. Now I'm going to throw this obstacle in your way. You have to get around this rock. How would this character get around that rock? So I do take into mind, what I'm steering the characters towards and what's coming up ahead, what road signs they'll see. But for me, and there's nothing wrong with doing it the way you're doing. I have a lot of respect for someone who does it with an outline, and I could do it with an outline, but I think it would hinder my style of writing. But I just put them in these situations to see where they're going, and oftentimes I don't know what the ending of the story actually is. I have some guesses, but I won't know until I get there.
Mhm.
And I think one of the advantages of doing that, or even adding it to what you already have, is that um, sometimes you'll just have this waitress character walk into um, the scene, and it's like, okay, it's just this one-dimensional character, nothing about this person, and then you end up writing like half your book about this character, and it's like, where the hell did this person come from? You discover new characters as you focus a little more on the character writing itself. But I don't know if you've ever heard this advice before, but I think it's really good if you want to start, enhancing your characters a bit, is with every character that enters into the scene, try to think about what they were doing right before that.
Mhm.
So, with the example of the waitress who comes in the scene carrying a plate of food, well, clearly she was in the kitchen picking up the food and putting it on the table. Even if you don't put that in your writing, you know that about the character, so that's going to kind of affect how you present that character to the story.
That's true. I think I have heard that advice before. Um, Usually the weird thing is that most of the characters that I try to strip out extraneous characters to the point where every character that I'm using is in the story is usually a main character. So it's almost like if they're not a main character, they're probably just a walk on, walk off. Like they're just somebody who doesn't even necessarily really interact with the main characters, which are almost interesting. But I realize sometimes you get some interesting elements from that. Like you can have a character, a waitress, who actually maybe she had a bad day, or maybe her eyes are all red because she's been crying because I don't know her son is sick, or what have you, or she's about to get thrown out of her apartment, and those kind of things can lead to interesting moments between the main characters. So I can definitely play with that more than I have in the past. Actually, it's funny. There is a little bit in my first graphic novel, I Have the Gods, which I thought was humorous. Some other people found humorous too because they commented on it later on about how I had a scene where the main character is talking to an FBI agent who basically had saved his life earlier in the book, and the main character, he has this ability of remote viewing. He has visions that leads to the murder. It's really just wrapped up in this conspiracy because of the murder, and he's kind of like talking to the FBI agent about feeling helpless, but not being able to help the people. He's using these visions because people are getting murdered, and things, horrible things are happening to him. And he's just like, how do you deal with the helplessness? How do you deal with not being able to help people? And the FBI agent's just like, you focus on the ones you can't help. You can't. I do a lot of awful things, okay, but I just focus on what I can do. And while they're having this heartfelt conversation, it's in an office building. In the background is some guy who, in the first panel of this conversation between the two characters, he grabs this woman's ass. The woman slaps him, and then as you progress through this conversation of the two characters, in the background, the woman proceeds to grab a chair and just beat the guy almost to death. And it's just one of those weird things where they're talking about this whole thing of like helping people you can help and you can't save everyone. And meanwhile, this guy who's just sort of a lecherous jerk, he's just getting the living shit kicked out of him. And it's stuff like that I can't remember what other comics I've seen. Like, I can't think of a specific comic off the top of my head, but there's tons of comics I've read where they have little background conversations the characters are having. That are just little character moments where it gives you a glimpse into, oh, there's all this other stuff going on in the world besides what's happening in the main story. Like, it's just people living their lives, and you sort of like you just brush up against another person's story, another person's narrative, You don't. It's not even intersecting with another narrative. You just brush up against someone else's narrative as he starts to go through their journey. The idea that there's multiple stories going on in this whole world, it gives that feeling of reality. Because everybody is a minor character in somebody else's story.
I think that's a trope we see in television quite a bit, where we see something going on in the background that's supposed to make us laugh, while we're in the foreground seeing another character interact with another character just talking, and they're like oblivious to this person in the background doing all this sort of stuff. And I don't know if that can be done with actual novelization, but definitely in a comic book, I think that'd be interesting to see. So you mentioned Eye of the Gods. I think that's your first self-published graphic novel. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I know the challenges of self-publishing, and I talk about that a lot, but what challenges did you have of doing a self-published graphic novel?
Well, I would say that the biggest challenge and also the biggest benefit was the fact that I having to do all the work myself. Comic books generally are a collaborative medium. A lot of times there'll be one person who's the writer, one person actually draws it in pencil, another person draws it in ink, a color artist, a letterer, a book designer, an editor. Even in indie comics, they'll definitely be a team, sometimes a smaller team, where it's just like the writer, editor, and then the visual artist and a colorist or a letterer. But I'm honestly a little bit of a control freak with my own process, and I like having control of all those things. I like doing all those things myself. I guess I feel like I want to understand the process on all levels, because if I were to work on collaborative projects down the line, I would like to be able to eloquently convey both what I wanted out of it, and also both by understanding having done it, be able to be respectful of other people's input and see how to ask for what I want while still giving enough leeway to bring their own flavor and their own creativity to it. So I don't know for sure if I'm going to work on collaborative projects in the future, because I actually find that I really do enjoy doing the whole book. A lot of people have often said, you should hire somebody to do your book. You should hire colors to do all this, and just focus on the writing and drawing part. There is wisdom and logic in that. That said, I enjoy doing it all myself. So in terms of the difficulty of self-publishing, it's the time that it takes to, for instance, on the writing part, when I originally wrote the book, I did it the way a lot of comic book artists, well, the way a lot of comic creators do, where they have a direction for where they're going to go with the series, and they write the first issue, they write the second issue, or the third issue. And even though I published it as a complete novel, it was broken down into chapters, and I was going to write each chapter as I published it. After I finished drawing the first chapter, I started on the second one, and I realized that there was some story problems that hadn't worked out. And it actually made me think, well, wait a minute, there's a whole character here that I might not actually even need. And it made me realize that, and that's probably where I become how I became much more of a plotter, is by learning that I saw there were structural problems that hadn't worked out. So instead of just doing each chapter as I went, I did thumbnail sketches of the entire story. And I lettered all of those sketches so I could read it as a book in sketch format. And in reading that, I was able to move some pieces around, add pages, delete pages, lost a couple of characters, restructure things, and then I started from scratch and went back and redrew that whole first chapter, and then redrew the whole book based on that structure.
So essentially, you did a storyboard of your own work with thumbnails.
Yes. And what's interesting that I have found over the course of producing that first series, now working on the new series, when I started, my writer brain and my artist brain were two separate entities. You would think that it is it would be highly advantageous to have one person be the artist and writer, and I think that it is advantageous. But I think a lot of people come to it from being an artist who draws for a lot of other writers, and eventually decides to write their own stuff, or a writer who has some drawing skill and decides, you know what, I've been taking classes, I'm going to jump out here and try and draw my own stuff. I came at it from the art end, and even though I'd only worked on a few collaborations with people earlier in my life, I'd probably say I was equally experienced at writing for other people as I was drawing for other people, meaning not very experienced in either one. But I had done both, so I kind of understood them from that side. So when I was writing, I really did approach it just thinking about the story first, not thinking about what I would want to draw. I was just trying to think what would make the best story. That created a lot of visual challenges for myself that I had to solve on the page. In an ideal world, I think that I think you have a writer who's capable of thinking visually. And I think that's true whether we're talking about prose or comics, because you want to use compelling narrative about dialogue. It's talking about painting imagery on the page that's compelling and draws people in. But in my particular case, I was writing. I'd like to think that as I've gone forward, I've learned to bring it closer where the writing and the visual storytelling are kind of happening at the same place in my brain. And the way I've tricked myself into doing that is, as opposed to the first version where I wrote everything out and then did the sketches and let it out read it as a book. With this new series, what I'm doing is I have a very tight outline of what happens with everything, broken down page by page by page. So I know what happens on the page, even though I haven't written out all the dialogue. And then what I do is I will go and I will draw the thumbnail sketches, the storyboards for each issue, and then go back and have the dialogue on top of that. And usually in my outline, my page by page outline, I do include dialogue, but I don't split over the dialogue. I don't, go back and rewrite. And a lot of it's placeholder dialogue. If I have to come up with a line that I think is good, that's clever, that works, that definitely goes in. But I know that I'm going to come back and probably rewrite the dialogue to fit the visuals a little bit later. And I think that actually is the way that a lot of comics tend to be written. But for my first book that I did, Eye of the Gods, I tried that and it didn't work. And I guess maybe it was taking it all the way, like again, things you learn from taking something to completion. I think I had to understand what it felt like to write out all of the dialogue first before I could go in and try and say, all right, here's what happens. Now here's what the characters say about what happens. Because the other thing I realized was I've been trying to give myself the freedom to use less dialogue and do more visual storytelling. Which in the first book, the difference was that I was simply trying to have like equal parts, like here's a shot of what the characters are doing, then what they're doing. And it felt a little bit more retro, like not in a good way, more like 50s, 60s dialogue where it's ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Whereas now I'm looking at it almost like an orchestra, where I may have like a solo, with a violin solo, where it's a sequence, 2 pages with no dialogue, but just 1 or 2 pieces of dialogue that accent certain things that the character would genuinely say at that moment. But give myself the freedom to have areas that are just visual narrative, and then have sequences where you have the characters doing very little, but it's jam-packed with conversation and dialogue, and the characters that are giving little insights into their personality or foreshadowing things that are going to happen. All the rich things we want to do with dialogue, and the art almost kind of takes a back seat in those sequences. And thinking around how to continue to make it a visual medium, even if the characters aren't going to be doing something actually, if the dialogue is the star in that particular scene. I mean, sometimes that's just as much as placing a scene in an interesting location. That gets into tricks that filmmakers and TV, producers do, where they take a boring conversation with characters, but place it like on a rooftop. Or the old trick in The West Wing, they have the walk and talk, where as long as the characters are moving through the White House and they're going from this to that, they're handing out papers to somebody and engaging, it feels like it's an action scene because there's kinetic things happening. But really just getting spoon-fed a whole lot of exposition in a hopefully clever and not blatant manner.
Now you see why it's called the squeaky chair interview. So, we did have a viewer and then he disappeared, so I was like going to celebrate and it's like, please ask us questions. It's, I'm hoping that like a year from now when I'm doing this, I have like 100 people viewing while we do these interviews to make it more interesting. But I wanted to touch on what you're saying about collaborative works. And, well, as a writer, there are opportunities to do collaborative works. I haven't done anything like that yet. But I've tried to do game design, and before my accident, I was in a game design company, and I think one of the hardest things to do is to do collaborative works. I've tried to do mods with other people on the internet. I've tried to do like bring people in and work on it, and I think one of the hardest part is the fact that sometimes you're just not paying people, that if they need some sort of motivation to do something, and if they don't have that motivation, then they have to form their own, and if they just don't have that capability, then you're pretty much left doing things by yourself. And I think that's one reason why I love writing as much as I do, is that most of the time I am by myself. Now, I do generate ideas and I like to bounce back with people back and forth when I can. But the thing about collaborative work that I've always hated is I end up being the leader, and I don't want to be the leader. I don't want to be the person making decisions. And it's funny, too, when it's someone else's idea. And they're like, okay, well, I want to do a... God, what are those called? When people take video games and make videos.
I don't know what you're talking about. I forget the name.
Machinima. There we go. So someone wanted to make a machinima of the Old Republic MMO. And it's like their idea and wanting to set up all these things. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll be happy to join in and offer, some suggestions and help get things started. And I ended up being the writer, the director, the producer, and I'm like, how the fuck did this happen? I just wanted to help, not control it.
You got played.
Probably. And then, the project never went anywhere because I was the only one doing work and no one ever showed up to do their part so we could record things. Ugh. So, I want to work on a collaborative projects, but I don't want to be the leader. Don't make me the leader.
Well, the challenge in something like that, I think, is either to be working on a project that the other person has a vested sense of ownership in. That it's not just somebody else's project they're working on, but they really... And it's tough to find a group that are all passionate about the same. The people are passionate. You might be passionate about, Knights of the Old Republic, but to find people that are all passionate about wanting to tell one singular story and they're unified and on the same page, that's a group that can work on that. Or the other alternative is also having a project that is almost like each person gets to solo on their own and make whatever it is that they want to do. More like anthology. Where you've got a theme, a larger theme that everyone is writing towards, but they're still doing their own thing. So it's more sort of like the fact that whether it's ownership of something that's just your own and you're putting a little piece in, whether it's ownership of we're all going to unite to make this, that sense of ownership I think is what makes collaboration really insane. That's what makes people bust their ass on something that they're not doing.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed in doing game design, not that I've actually ever made anything, but I've certainly tried, is that the people want to be the ideas person, where they just come up with the idea and make $1 million because they said the elves should be blue. Mm-hmm. And it's like... And I knew right away when I got into game design, it's not so simple as just coming up with an idea. You need to provide some sort of background on what this idea is. You know, if the elves should be blue, why? Why should they be blue? What effect will this have on the product? You know, is there some sort of outside source that you can link to that will give us some sort of insight? There's a lot of work to just coming up with an idea. I mean, it's almost like you have to write a dissertation on a simple idea. And people don't want to do that. They want to do as little work as possible, but get as much recognition as they can. So I think it's definitely true what you're saying is you've got to find people that are very dedicated to doing the project. But my biggest challenge is I've just never really found anyone else like that, because I'm willing to do a lot of the things that need to be done, but I can't be the only one who's doing that. I need other people who are willing to do it as well.
Well, I think with something like that, it's a strange alchemy that can't necessarily be calculated or manufactured. It's an alchemy of having both a group of people that are equally passionate about the same topic, but then also having the right project to collaborate on. Because maybe, like for instance, who knows, if all the other people that were supposed to be involved with one of the game things we were working on were passionate about writing. They were all, we're going to write an anthology book that basically here's the thing, imagine if instead of doing world building through documents, you're doing world building through an anthology. Basically everyone said, this is your section of the world, tell me a story about it. Go. And if everyone was actually passionate about writing, and then you actually were to put that together, then that book could be something that would, and maybe publishing that anthology would be the thing that would lead people to say, oh, wow, well, let's build this mod out proper. Now we've actually got something we're excited about. I think that when you're literally building something out of nothing, like, for instance, game design, writing is building something out of nothing, but the act of telling story is a very human, fundamental experience. We tell people stories every day. Just, how was your day? Did you catch and see a news on the news? I read this interesting magazine article to tell you about it. World building in terms of game design, I think that it taps the same muscles as narrative writing, but it doesn't tap them. It doesn't tap them in the exciting way that storytelling does. It taps it in an architectural way, in a scientific way. The same thing that, how art and the arts and the sciences are definitely related. They both require creative thinking. But the thinking of an engineer is not necessarily the thinking of a poet. Now, you can bring some poetry to engineering, and by the same token, you can bring structure to poetry you can use things from the other field to solve creative problems in your own. But I would say that, in that difference between writing about a world that you're building versus the actual world building itself, some people just want to play in the this is what happened to me today world. People aren't interested in solving math equations. People who enjoy puzzles, enjoy solving problems and building puzzles and building problems, those people are the kind of people that would be much more engaged in something like a game, world building game development. So that's where we get that thing where it's not just it's the combination of the right mix of people and the right project. And that's speaking from somebody who actually, the only massive collaborative project I think I've worked on some small anthologies, but I would say that cartoon series I worked on was really the biggest collaborative project I've worked on. And even in that, it was very interesting because I was working with people that were far more experienced than I was. So I always felt like I was treading this line between putting out what I thought my creative vision for the idea was, while trying to be open to the counsel and the experience of people that knew far more about what they were doing than I did. And I think in the end, the project suffered mostly from my experience. Because I think that if I were more experienced, I could have found ways to say what I could have brought stronger ideas that would have got something close to what my original vision of the project was.